Margaret Sullivan stood behind the counter of her small flower shop in Brooklyn, arranging white roses with the same careful precision she had maintained for the past 3 years. At 52, her hands still moved with grace, though the wedding ring that once adorned her finger was long gone. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of petals and promises, casting golden shadows across bundles of lavender and baby's breath. The bell above the door chimed. Margaret looked up, her heart sinking as she recognized the couple walking in. Her ex-husband, Richard, entered with his new wife, Amber, a woman barely 30 with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer handbag that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Margaret asked, forcing professionalism into her voice. Richard smirked, his eyes scanning the modest shop with barely concealed disdain. "We need flowers for the Hartley wedding reception. Something elegant. Can you handle that, Maggie?" The nickname stung. He used to whisper it with affection. Now it dripped with condescension. "Of course. When do you need them delivered?" Amber laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the quiet shop. "Richard, honey, are you sure this place can handle the Hartley wedding? I mean, look at it. So dated." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I've been handling weddings in this neighborhood for 15 years. The Hartleys trust my work." Richard leaned against the counter, his expensive cologne overwhelming the natural scent of flowers. "You know what your problem is, Maggie? You never moved forward. Still stuck in this little shop, still wearing those same conservative dresses. You're too old for love, too old for dreams, too old for anything exciting." The words landed like physical blows. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her order pad. "Richard, that's enough," she said quietly. "It's the truth," he continued, emboldened by Amber's giggles. "When I left you, I thought maybe you'd reinvent yourself. But you're still the same boring, middle-aged woman I divorced. At least I moved on. Found someone who understands that life is for living, not hiding." Margaret set down her pen, meeting his eyes with a dignity that surprised even herself. "I'll prepare your order. It will be ready by Friday." As they turned to leave, Amber Stage whispered loudly enough for Margaret to hear, "Can you imagine being that age and still single? How depressing." The door closed behind them. Margaret stood alone in her shop, surrounded by beautiful flowers that suddenly felt like witnesses to her humiliation. She walked to the back room, leaned against the wall, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel the pain. 3 minutes to remember the 20-year marriage that ended when Richard decided she wasn't exciting enough, wasn't young enough, wasn't enough. But Margaret Sullivan hadn't survived a divorce and built a business from nothing by staying down. She wiped her eyes, straightened her apron, and returned to the counter. The afternoon brought regular customers. Mrs. Chun buying carnations for her husband's birthday. Tommy Rodriguez picking up a bouquet for his girlfriend. Each transaction reminded Margaret why she loved this work. She was part of people's happy moments, their celebrations, their expressions of love. At 5 o'clock, as she was closing, a black Mercedes pulled up outside. Margaret watched through the window as a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stepped out. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from power, not arrogance. His dark hair showed distinguished threads of silver at the temples, and his face carried the map of a life fully lived. He entered the shop, and Margaret found herself straightening instinctively. "Are you Margaret Sullivan?" His voice was deep, with a slight Italian accent that made her name sound like music. "I am. How can I help you?" "My name is Vincent Castellano. I'm hosting a private event next month. I need someone who understands flowers, not just someone who arranges them. Someone who can tell a story with petals and stems." Margaret tilted her head, intrigued. "What kind of story?" Vincent smiled, and something in his eyes suggested he saw more than just a middle-aged florist in a small Brooklyn shop. "That depends. What stories do flowers tell you?" For the first time that day, Margaret felt something other than pain. She felt seen. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks preparing for Vincent Castellano's event. He had ordered arrangements for what he described as a family gathering, but the budget he provided suggested something far more significant. She researched his name online one evening and felt her stomach drop. Vincent Castellano wasn't just wealthy. He was connected to one of New York's most prominent Italian families, the kind whispered about in restaurants and featured in carefully worded newspaper articles. She almost called to cancel. But then she remembered Richard's words. Too old for anything exciting. The day before the Hartley wedding delivery, Margaret was adding final touches to a centerpiece when the shop door burst open. Richard stormed in, his face red with anger. "You did this on purpose," he shouted. Margaret set down her scissors carefully. "Did what?" "Don't play innocent. You told the Hartleys about Amber and me, about how we met." Margaret's confusion was genuine. "I have no idea what you're talking about. They canceled the wedding flowers with us. Said they didn't want to support a man who cheated on his wife with his secretary and then rubbed it in her face. Those were their exact words, Maggie." "I never spoke to the Hartleys about our personal life," Margaret said firmly. "Maybe they figured it out themselves. Brooklyn is a small community." "Richard." His eyes narrowed. "You're pathetic. Trying to sabotage my happiness because you're miserable and alone." Before Margaret could respond, the door opened again. Vincent Castellano stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the small space. His eyes moved from Richard's aggressive stance to Margaret's pale face. "Is there a problem here?" Vincent's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority. "This is a private conversation," Richard snapped, then seemed to recognize something in Vincent's bearing that made him step back slightly. "It stopped being private when you started shouting at a lady in her own establishment," Vincent replied, moving closer to Margaret. "Miss Sullivan, are you all right?" Richard laughed nervously. "Look, we're just having a discussion about business. Nothing that concerns you." Vincent's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Everything that concerns Miss Sullivan concerns me. I suggest you leave now." Richard looked between them, confusion mixing with his anger. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who recognizes quality when he sees it," Vincent said softly. "Something you apparently never learned." Richard's face flushed deeper, but he was smart enough to recognize danger when it stood in front of him. He shot Margaret one last venomous look. "You'll regret this," he muttered before leaving. Margaret exhaled shakily. "You didn't have to do that." Vincent turned to her, his expression softening. "Yes, I did. Nobody speaks to you that way. Not in your own shop. Not anywhere." Vincent didn't leave after Richard stormed out. Instead, he walked slowly through the shop, examining the arrangements Margaret had prepared for his event. His fingers brushed against a cascade of deep red roses intertwined with white orchids. "You put stories into these," he said quietly. "This one speaks of passion that's been tested but survived. Am I right?" Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. The client requested something that represented enduring love. A 50th wedding anniversary. Vincent turned to face her. "And what would you create for someone starting over? Someone who thought their time for beauty had passed, only to discover they were wrong?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she moved to her workbench. "I would use autumn dahlias," she said softly. "They bloom late in the season, when other flowers have faded. They're proof that the most magnificent beauty sometimes comes with age and patience." Vincent moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "That ex-husband of yours is a fool." "You don't know anything about my marriage," Margaret replied, but without defensiveness. "I know enough. I know he had something precious and was too blind to see it. I know he broke something in you that day he left, but you built yourself back anyway. And I know that right now you think you're too old, too late, too ordinary for extraordinary things to happen." Margaret met his gaze, her heart pounding. "Those are his words, not mine." "Then prove him wrong. Come to dinner with me tomorrow night. Not as my florist, as my guest." The invitation shocked her into silence. Vincent Castellano was asking her on a date. A man who could have anyone, who moved in circles she'd only read about. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me?" "Because when I walked into this shop 3 weeks ago, I saw a woman who had been knocked down but refused to stay there. Because you speak the language of beauty and meaning. And because the moment your ex-husband started shouting at you, I watched you stand taller instead of shrinking. That kind of strength is rare, Margaret. And it's beautiful. If you're rooting for Margaret right now, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. This story is just beginning, and the transformation ahead will surprise everyone. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed after Richard's cruelty. These were tears of something awakening inside her, something she thought had died 3 years ago. Okay, she said, her voice stronger now. Dinner tomorrow. Vincent smiled, and it transformed his entire face. 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up here. As he left, Margaret stood in her flower shop, surrounded by blooms and possibilities. For the first time since her divorce, she felt something dangerous and wonderful stirring in her chest. Hope. The restaurant Vincent chose was the kind of place Margaret had only seen in magazines. Soft piano music floated through the candlelit room, and waiters moved like dancers between tables where New York's elite discussed business and romance in hushed tones. Margaret wore a deep blue dress she'd bought that afternoon, her first new clothing purchase in over a year. As Vincent pulled out her chair, she caught her reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman looking back. Eyes bright, shoulders straight, alive. Tell me something true about yourself, Vincent said after they ordered. Something you've never told anyone. Margaret considered lying, offering something safe. Instead, she found herself saying, I'm terrified that Richard was right, that I wasted my best years on a marriage that meant nothing, and now I'm just going through the motions until I fade away completely. Vincent reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Your best years aren't behind you, Margaret. They're happening right now. Every moment you choose to keep living fully. Their conversation flowed like wine, easy, intoxicating, real. Vincent told her about his family, the weight of expectations, the loneliness that came with power. Margaret shared her dreams of expanding her shop, maybe teaching floral design, traveling to see the gardens of Europe she'd only read about. 2 hours disappeared like minutes. As they finished dessert, Vincent's phone buzzed. His expression darkened as he read the message. What's wrong? Margaret asked. There's a situation I need to handle. A family matter. Vincent hesitated, then said, Come with me. Now? Trust me. 20 minutes later, they arrived at an elegant event hall in Manhattan. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the venue from the newspaper society pages. This was the Hartley wedding, the one Richard and Amber were supposed to provide flowers for after the Hartleys canceled Margaret's order. Vincent, what are we doing here? Making things right. Inside, the reception was in chaos. The replacement florist had failed to deliver, leaving the bride in tears and empty tables where centerpieces should have been. Margaret spotted Richard in the corner, arguing frantically with the wedding planner while Amber stood nearby, looking furious. Vincent walked directly to the bride's parents. Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, I believe I can solve your problem. This is Margaret Sullivan, the finest florist in New York. She can transform this room in 2 hours if you'll allow it. Mrs. Hartley's eyes widened with recognition. Margaret, oh thank God. We should never have canceled with you. We were just so angry about what that awful man did. Margaret looked at the empty room, then at Richard's shocked face across the hall, then at Vincent's confident smile. Something fierce and powerful rose inside her chest. Give me your storage room, your vases, and access to a 24-hour flower market, she said. I'll give you a wedding worth remembering. Margaret worked like a woman possessed. Vincent made calls, and within 30 minutes, 3 flower market vendors arrived with everything she needed. Her hands moved with practiced precision, creating cascading arrangements of ivory roses, blush peonies, and trailing jasmine. Each centerpiece became a masterpiece, each archway a garden of dreams. The wedding guests began arriving for the reception, gasping as they entered the transformed hall. What had been bare and disappointing now glowed with ethereal beauty. Candles flickered among the flowers, casting dancing shadows that made the room feel enchanted. Richard stood frozen near the entrance, watching Margaret direct the final placements with the confidence of a conductor leading an orchestra. Amber had long since left, claiming a headache, but everyone knew she couldn't bear watching Richard's ex-wife succeed where they had failed. The bride, Sarah Hartley, approached Margaret with tears streaming down her face. "This is beyond anything I imagined. You saved my wedding." Margaret hugged her gently. Every bride deserves magic on her wedding day. Mrs. Hartley appeared beside them, checkbook in hand. "Name your price, Margaret. Whatever it is, it's not enough." Before Margaret could respond, Richard's voice cut through the moment. "This is insane. You people are treating her like she's some kind of artist. She runs a tiny flower shop in Brooklyn." The room fell silent. Vincent Castellano stepped forward, positioning himself beside Margaret. His presence commanded immediate attention. "You're right about one thing," Vincent said, his voice carrying across the hall. "She does run a shop in Brooklyn. A shop built on talent, integrity, and grace. Qualities you wouldn't recognize if they knocked you down. This woman took a disaster and turned it into perfection in under 2 hours. While you stood in the corner making excuses, she made miracles." Richard's face purpled. "Who do you think you are?" Vincent smiled coldly. "Vincent Castellano. And Margaret Sullivan is with me. Now and for as long as she'll have me." The room erupted in whispers. Everyone knew the Castellano name. Richard's eyes widened with the realization of exactly who he'd been dismissing. Margaret felt something break free inside her chest. Not breaking apart, but breaking open. She looked at Richard, the man who had made her feel small and finished, and felt nothing but pity. "You told me I was too old for love," she said clearly. "Too old for dreams. Too old for anything exciting. But the truth is, Richard, age was never my problem. Fear was. And I'm not afraid anymore." She turned to Vincent, whose eyes held pride and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. The band began playing. Vincent extended his hand. "Dance with me, Margaret Sullivan. Let's show everyone what it looks like when two people refuse to let the world tell them their story is over." Margaret took his hand and stepped onto the dance floor. Around them, the flowers she had created bore witness to her resurrection. 18 months later, Margaret stood in the sunlit courtyard of her new location, Sullivan and Castellano Fine Florals, an elegant storefront in Manhattan's Flower District. The space was 3 times larger than her Brooklyn shop, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a design studio where she now taught weekend workshops to aspiring florists. Vincent appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He'd been at a morning meeting but always made time to visit before lunch. Their routine had become as natural as breathing. "Mrs. Chun called," he said, handing her a cup. "She wants you to do flowers for her granddaughter's wedding. Says nobody else will do." Margaret smiled, remembering the woman who'd bought carnations in her old shop. Some things don't change, but so much had. The workshop space buzzed with students learning the language of flowers. Margaret's designs had been featured in 3 major magazines. She traveled to the gardens of Provence and the tulip fields of Amsterdam, Vincent at her side for every adventure. Her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Sarah Hartley, now pregnant with her first child, asking Margaret to design the nursery florals. Attached was a photo, Sarah and her husband at a charity gala, with Richard visible in the background, looking significantly less confident than he once had. His marriage to Amber had lasted 8 months. Margaret felt no satisfaction in his struggles, only gratitude for the freedom his departure had given her. The door chimed. A young woman entered, nervous and hesitant, clutching a small budget sheet. Margaret recognized that look. The same uncertainty she'd worn for years, believing she wasn't enough. "Welcome," Margaret said warmly. "Tell me what you're dreaming of." As she consulted with the bride-to-be, Vincent watched from across the room. That evening, over dinner at their favorite restaurant, he would present her with a velvet box containing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Margaret would say yes, not because she needed rescuing, but because she had learned that true love doesn't diminish you, it expands you. The wedding would be small, intimate, filled with flowers that told their story. Mrs. Chun would cry happy tears. Former students would create the arrangements. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in a small apartment, Richard would read about it in the society pages and finally understand what he'd lost. But that was still to come. For now, Margaret Sullivan stood in her thriving shop, teaching a young bride that beauty has no age limit, that reinvention is always possible, and that the best chapters of life often begin when you stop listening to people who can't see your worth.